one of the consistent preoccupations that runs through everything is your concern with working without references, with making systems that aren't reliant on anything outside themselves. That's kind of legible from the scale of the architectural projects to the artworks. And I'd just like to interrogate that theme really a bit more. I mean, Sofia, you kind of touched on it kind of initially when you were talking about how little there was in your local context that you discovered when you started making work together that you found valuable really as a starting point for practice. And it sort of reminded me a little of the position of someone like Kazuo Shinohara, you know, who was very explicitly saying he wanted to make an architecture which had no connection with Western architecture. There was but neither ultimately with traditional Japanese architecture either. Could you just expand a little on what you found, frustrating or how it's perhaps surprising to us knowing the richness of South American architecture that you didn't find anything within that indigenous culture that was useful to you?
No, well, I grew up in Patagonia, in the tip of Argentina, and he's Chilean, we live in Chile, and of course, when you think of pre-Columbian architecture, it all happens all the way to Peru and a little bit in the north of Chile, but where we are, it's almost non-existent. There's nothing left, and especially in Chile, anything that might be left has been repeatedly knocked over by earthquakes. There's a very strong earthquake culture. History, I don't know. Well, it is a culture,
Yeah. Now we have a culture.
Yes, you certainly do. So I think, of course, one looks at the built environment around it for references, but everything is very recent. Everything is there. We try to show it with images there simultaneously. And we felt that we couldn't distinguish authority in those models because they were already a copy of a copy of a copy. And I think it's very much what Borges says as well, no? That you are very distant and you can take what reaches you and consider it a second grade situation, or you can look aside and say, okay, I don't have those references, and choose that as your way of looking at things.
And at a prosaic level, those seismic considerations do dictate a certain amount of the formal vocabulary and a set of considerations which do separate you both from the vernacular architecture of Chile's past and from the forms of much of Western architecture. Would you build differently if you were building in another culture?
No, certainly, yes. The fact that there's a Darwinian, almost very fast improvement in, of course, in structural terms, but that involves other aspects as well. Because every 30 years, everything is knocked down. So yes, it does. A lot of our decisions also is the projects we've shown, almost all of them are very modest budget projects, and so initially we were always aware that we needed to put the energy where it was necessary, and of course structure is extremely necessary, but we're not only interested in structure as gravitational carrying of loads, but it's more that to put the energy where it's most needed.
Yeah, perhaps there is a lesson in nature that have taught us or trained us to be careful with the resources, and even if we build something outside Chile, like this house, I think they are part of the same research. So they look similar, and also not only because of this natural way of thinking, because we think we can't change the way we think just because we're doing a project somewhere else, but also because in our original place, in our native context, we never took advantage of a certain degree of expressivity of those forces. So it's not like, for example, Brazilian architecture, I'm talking in general terms, that every column tries to show a certain tension. In our case, we're not putting the energy there. It's most of the time rooms are clad with panels with wooden boards, hiding the structure, because we're not trying to say something or to explore the structure or the physicality of the bones, but these other kind of bones that are more imaginary, the geometry of the rooms, that hidden geometry of relationships. So the construction is at the service of that logic.
And at the same time, we've been talking about this development of a language in response to a local condition, or an absence of a local condition, as it were. But you are of a particular, you have a generation of architects, and you have friends and contemporaries kind of across Europe and in America too, who are kind of represent a sort of return to an essential grammar of architecture after the period of Hadid and Giri. I mean, are those a kind of association friendships with, I know you're friends with people like Kirsten Gears and David Van Severen, whose work has, characteristics that you could say are in common. Are those connections that were useful to you at the beginning of your development, or these? How do you feel you were reacting against the situation?
No, not at the beginning. We were not reacting to anything, because perhaps they were working in a place where those references were relevant. Perhaps they felt the necessity to be reactive, to kill the fathers. We didn't have any fathers to kill, but I do agree that with time and with work, because it's very hard to maintain a position if you don't have any work behind. We discovered that we had certain affinities, for sure, and we became friends, and we have done some projects together. And but I think we're every day more clear about what makes us different. But it's not that we were trying to do something in opposition to something else. We were doing something, and with time we realized that we are wandering the same arenas.
It's interesting that Office's work is incredibly grounded in reference.
Yes,
That Kirsten has an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of architecture, and is making very mannerist relationships to the work of SOM or Philip Johnson, whoever it may be. And your work, which comes to similar formal conclusions often, is very determinedly not drawing drawing directly on kind of reference in that way.
I wouldn't agree so much about the similarity in grammar. I think our work is extremely different, and every day even more. And if you talk about materials, even more. Yeah. But it's true that we don't work with references, and they do. And nowadays, I think it's very, very common to work with references as a way of perhaps to communicate an idea, or to go for a certain objective. And since our work is so much rooted in simple relationships, we don't need that kind of input.
Yeah, probably the references in many cases are used they're a shortcut, but they're also a conveyor of authority or credibility. And in our case, I think there are other aspects, like very normal elements or geometry, that we think are enough for us to feel on safe ground to work on.
But also, I guess one could argue that an architecture that does rely on reference is an architecture that's committed to an idea of commonality and urbanity, ultimately. The reference becomes a language, a system
Yeah.
of language that allows buildings to speak to one another.
Yeah,
I mean, you've been showing a lot of pavilions or a lot of buildings which have a rather lonely, kind of solitary kind of aspect.
yes.
Is there an urban vision there? Is there the possibility of making a city out of this architecture?
It's hard to tell. It's we cannot say if this can be applied, and we don't have any intention of being prophetic about a single way of producing architecture. This is what we have shared, what is comfortable for us, what makes us
I
happy.
think, as Pezo was saying before, the way we do things we try to understand it as we have been doing it, and suddenly felt comfortable with an approach that we slowly try to understand as well, and we're also questioning as we go. And of course, it's it is constructed as such, based on the cases that we have at hand. So we don't have a vision for what is to come. We might use the same tools we've been using now, or we're open also to trying to discover other things. I think I find myself quite young. I hope to be doing other projects. But
it's true what Sofia was commenting at the beginning about the position that perhaps it's very hard for someone that practices or is in this particular context, in the European context, to think about another alternative way of producing architecture without referring to this enormous backpack of references and treatises and ideologies and reactions and personalities that are very very influential. Because in our case, we have a very superficial notion of what is happening. Of course, we have read many of the books that every student in School of Architecture has read, but I don't know. We felt that there is a distance, that we are, and in fact, there is a beautiful distinction that Borges used for that translation. He was a great translator as well, and the notion of bad translation in opposition to mistranslation.
To mistranslation.
Mistranslation. Yeah. A mistranslation involves a level of intentionality, and a bad translation, which was what he was defending, was a new construction in a more naive manner, without any ideological background. So it was a new meaning by changing some words. The meaning was completely different, and that was a creative activity by the translator in the words of Borges.
I mean, it relates. When I came to see your students' work last year in Austin, and the project that you'd set the students was each of it began with you giving them each a church plan of,
yes.
From a different church in Rome, from which they would then extrapolate a number of
yes.
Different forms through extrusion and selecting one, and then you gave them a site subsequently on which this form was developed into a building. So there was exactly this sort of. There was all the way along. There was a determination to subvert the students' expectations about authorship, and in a way, what was being asked of them was to perform a series of bad translations.
Yes, exactly, and especially because in academia there is so the pressure of time is so great that we use these shortcuts to force them to see reality in a more direct manner. So if we ask them to bring a very creative idea for a church, they're going to be, we would be paralyzed. But if we start manipulating something that they don't know very well, but by drawing a plan in a very short period of time and making a model and then changing proportions of that model, they start realizing about maybe fundamental relationships or archetypical conditions of space, and almost without realizing they are thinking and producing something very extremely original.
I mean, this combination of an arbitrary starting point and a very systematic development feels a common recurring kind of theme in your work, even the kind of Romans that you were showing at the end are kind of predicated on that sort of a process.
Yes, I think we see that the training of judgment is stronger, and also a very profound belief in architecture, in the physical aspects of it. We think that by combining these two, it's enough. Reality is so complex that, of course, you'll have to articulate an immense amount of problems and also your own personal interests, that we try to, I think, concentrate all the energy when we're teaching and also in our work in the aspects that we think can be small devices of articulation, but within architectonic means. And we try not to look beyond those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, then you can speculate and see the consequences of those decisions and read them and try to understand what is the implication of that building with that particular orientation, I don't know, with the access, with the sun, with the topography, with the culture of the place, with the material. But those are, you need to go as fast as possible to start taking those measurements. And therefore the very notion of an architectonic problem, it's very, very subtle. To be trained to solve problems, but we're not solving economical problem. Well, there is an economy implicit in that articulation, but and also in a political problem or ideological problems. There are many problems, but there are practical problems that need to be, that are extremely architectonic. The dimension of a column or the distance between one column and the next one. So you need to know what is the implication and the connection of those kind of problems with the larger problems. And most of the time, especially in academia, students turn to be concerned with the other problems and not with the specificity of a discipline.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask about your own working method? I mean, there's the two of you do have assistants, mm-hmm. but I think the generative ideas of the work are really yours. It's not a big atelier as such. No. I mean, one of the attractions I can imagine of working with references is that it does serve as a shorthand that allows you to communicate with a big team. Do you see that, is there the possibility within your way of working of a larger scale of operation? Is it essential that it's produced in such a sort of intimate relationship?
Yeah, it's clearly we have an intimate relationship with ourselves and with architecture. It's inevitable. We are thinking and talking about architecture and ourselves always, in the morning, in the night, and so that's very hard to share. We haven't tried.
No, we should
Yes.
get
But,
a lover, but
Yeah.
no, there's no way you can achieve this level of intensity the way we have, and also we teach together, we travel together, we work together. So I think we've become utterly vulnerable now. We're interdependent, which is, it's very good.
Up to a certain extent.
You are more
You're more dependent, yeah.
No, but it's interesting, the notion of scale, because normally there is a confusion between the scale of a practice and the scale of a project or the scale of a building, or even more directly. And I don't think there is a direct correspondence, because sometimes you have a large practice with maybe 100 people, but maybe they have 100 projects. And they are running with complex projects with many square meters, so they are dedicating very little time to the projects, instead of a small practice that sometimes, our case is that we work in one project at a time, maybe two, and they overlap when one is finishing and going to construction, and the other one is in the initial phase. So we can do it. We have the capacity to be really focused on that idea, and that can be extended to larger projects. So I don't think that any of this, the museum or the cultural center we're doing, or the innovation center, are more complex than a house. It's the same. Maybe more pages of drawings, but
We've been talking about the sort of elemental quality of the architecture, that it's that this return to a kind of grammar of essential forms, but there's also always a sort of ambiguity in the work that you're to take maybe an example that everyone who's went to the Royal Academy would know, the piece at the Blue Pavilion, where the columns are also staircases, or often in your work, a window might be of a dimension that it's actually a window opening is a room in itself, as the Casa Poli. Could you talk a little about that relationship of a sort of the very self-evident and primal and this sort of mannerist ambiguity that you're interested
in? Yeah, that's something that we mentioned briefly, is our interest in producing this naive intentionality, which is as an idea is a contradiction. You can be naive if you're intentional, but perhaps that's the only distinction between vernacular architecture and architecture, lies in the degree of intentionality, because vernacular architecture, according to Rudowski, is unaware of itself, and we as architects have this capacity, or maybe we're condena, how do you say it? Condemnation, no, to be condemned to be always intentionalizing things, places, and doing it with a certain intention. But I think that normally intention is associated with the or assumed as a level of not only awareness but rationality, and we are skeptical about that. We think that intention might be very loose, and of course, which is a very known example, if you add 2 + 2, you know the answer in a rational, in a very predictable way. But if your answer is 6 or 7, there is something illogical that is very rich, and that has a lot of potential for architecture, because the city is not logical, because a building, what happens in a building, it's impossible. We have the illusion that we can predict and we can control and make a drawing to say this is going to be that house. We know certain aspects of that future reality. So we find that it's very unfair to think that we can control that reality, therefore that we can control all the level of intentionality of a building.
Can I ask about the relationship of the buildings to the drawings or to the paintings, which you, among all practices working today, I can think of few who are so precise about the means of representation. And often one feels a very direct relationship between the way that a drawing is constructed and the way that the architecture operates in the world. I guess to return to the house on the screen, or the piece in the Royal Academy, where the dominant axis is at 45 degrees to the primary axis of view is at 45 degrees to the dominant geometry of the building. It seems a recurring kind of motif, and one that is very strongly emphasized in the axonometric projections that you make. And one thinks of things like John Haydock's Diamond House series from the kind of the 70s as having that sort of ambiguity between representation and the built outcome. I think Pezo, described to me as Haydock's buildings as effectively being illustrations of the drawings, and that being something you want to avoid. Could you kind of just pick apart the distinction there?
Yeah, in our case it's the opposite. Well, we paint, we have done many paintings and drawings as paintings as drawings. The moment we paint buildings, or there are a couple of lines. One that is more, in a way, theoretical, because those are projects that are in the air and are an autonomous exploration. And there are others that are depicting a building we're doing. And normally they are showing some aspect of a building, but without trying to replace the building. We never are going to claim that that's architecture or that is more important than the building. They're secondary or parallel or lateral to the built reality that we find it we cannot replace. So there are tools for us to think, and especially because we use several techniques from watercolor, acrylic to oil on canvas, and the fact that oil on canvas is so slow that we need several layers and time, it's also a way for us to have time to think about what we have done or certain moments of the project. But they clearly run in parallel.
They run in parallel, but they're constantly crossing over or feeding from discoveries we can do in the series we were discussing the other night, the series of, we call them interiors, which is these relations of
these axonometries we showed.
We showed
sequence.
several. They don't turn into a building necessarily, but the discussion of thinking about those relations and also painting them. Painting them is a very important process of turning that into some physical construction or translation, which is always richer than the abstract idea. Both things inform very much the rest of our process.
And it's different from, to put a daunting sort of a reference in the room. I mean, Corbusier's practice of making architecture and art in parallel feels like a sort of a comparison that could be made. But with Le Corbusier, certainly the paintings almost served as a dress rehearsal for developments in the formal vocabulary of the buildings. But for you, that relationship isn't so direct. These are almost.
But there are always a crossing from one field to the other. So sometimes we discover that we're painting something that is already in a building, or sometimes we discover something that we start applying in a building, and they're always very much connected.
We don't have an exact position of. We understand all of what we've shown as the same thing. We don't have pockets to store certain types of work. They somehow are different formats just to explore transversal issues. Sometimes it's faster to go in a painting, or at least it's more autonomous when we don't have to wait for a client if we want to explore something. And other times the building allows us to open a new door that then can feed into the painting.
We've got about half an hour left, so I thought this might be a good moment to open any questions from the floor. Lots of hands. Okay.
Thank you for this lecture. It was very precise and I enjoyed it very much. The question is, what is your relationship with the idea of the concept in architecture? Because, for example, where I've been trained, they told me that you start with a concept, and then you fight with the client, fight with the builder, fight with the construction, everyone to manage your concept to
your concept,
get to reality.
Yeah.
But I see that you have an approach that is about findings along the way, in a way that you have a process, you have things that you care about, but it seems like you're very open for what can happen. And yet your work has very much forms of consistency in itself. So I was wondering, what do you think about the idea of a concept in architecture, and if for you concept is your own process or way of working itself?
Yeah.
We think the concept is, I don't want to have your professors hate us, but I think it's a very reductive approach. Maybe it does help at early stages of academia, but in our case, it somehow freezes a solution very early in time. And as we were saying, we understand the project. For example, we never win competitions because we don't apply concepts which are a very easy way of communication or reduction of a theme.
With a slogan,
Yes. So maybe we are the ones who are wrong. But we feel that the information that goes into a project is much more complex, and there's not such a big hierarchy that you can establishing all of those variables so as to put one name to a project. And therefore, what we end up articulating of all of these variables is what we call the spatial structure, or this invisible skeleton that then is in itself what you maybe call the consistency through the project, but it's also something that is flexible enough to incorporate a lot of changes or informality of the whole process. As in the same way as reality is extremely complex, the process of doing a project is fairly long, and it does change and it does adapt. So we feel that if we are able to find the right right spatial structure that is strong enough and that is focused on the key elements, we can then survive the process.
Yeah, because in a way, the notion of concept, which is in a way very similar to the notion of the partie or the grand gesture, or the notion of a metaphor or something that you can use as an illustration for an idea, for a main idea. It's indeed very reductive because it's a kind of umbrella to then go to the little aspects of the project. But in fact, those little aspects of the project, the many variables of defining an axis or the thickness of a wall, or that is the project. There is a lot of potential in discovering what that space and that sequence of rooms are going to be. So it's a very dangerous way of approaching. Because it is assuming that there is a hierarchy in a building. It's like saying that normally when we make a presentation, we present the place and then how the program is distributed and then the construction. There is a linear sequence because, of course, there is one slide after the other and this is time. But architecture is not that. Everything is happening at the same time. The program, the context, the materials, the budgets, the window, the little detail, everything is one thing. So we are very skeptical about trying to reduce the reality of architecture to words or to main things.
One of the reasons why some of us may be here is because we've seen your works in books or online, and they're sort of interpreted by media.
Mm-hmm.
And with the constant media barrage, I'm sure there's this kind of idea of time as well,
Mm-hmm.
how they work much faster than perhaps you want them to. So what is this junction between what your work may be, what you consider it to be, or what is self-evident, with what people interpret it?
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's interesting because we don't believe that those photographs or drawings or paintings or texts or comments or like or don't like are important. That's only material that circulates, that are representations, or not even the representations, they are depictions, very loose depictions of another reality, which is what we really are focused on building. So we are not working for that system of depictions, but for the real reality. And so we don't really...
We should be having this conversation in Chile. But that's also the big problem of our discipline. We're always referring to most of the things we have not physically been in. It is a dilemma.
Could you say a little about how you work together? About what is the process always the same?
No, I will only add that in this notion of format, the definition of the proper outline, what happens inside is in opposition to the traditional compositional process where you place elements to make a certain balance. We're not so interested in that compositional condition, but in a system that we call, and it has been called historically, as a determination process. So everything it's a more open system that makes, or it is produced along the way as a system of relationships.
regarding how we work together. Pezo's very, very creative.
And Sofia is very, very, very critical.
Yes, no, so yeah, I'd say he puts many, many ideas on the table, even after I've made up my mind which one's the best. No, but no, and we're always sort of bouncing back and forth. Yes, trying to find a balance. It's a very gradual process. There's no big gestures, big decisions, big concepts. It has to find the right balance.
It's a lot of
understanding,
conversation and
understanding deeply the problem and the variables before being able to propose something.
But it's very, very difficult. We are always struggling. Now we're opening our heart.
No, we should lie down. We should lie down.
No, it's no, because it's this the idea that an architect can predict reality. For me, it's fascinating. It's a jump into a void, because your work is to build a reality that is going to be built in the future. And not only that, but it has to perform and well in a future you don't know. So it's a paradox. It's almost impossible. So and that's, for us, it's very frightening to be able to make it right. How do you anticipate that reality to be as intense as you expected, and as meaningful as you expected, and as sometimes logical as you expected? I guess that's the beauty of doing architecture.
Thank you both very, very much. I can't think of many architects working today whose output really constitutes a whole world. And in your case, one made of very modest elements, but which add up to something incredibly rich. And it's just an endless source of fascination. I'm hugely grateful for you coming across the ocean, and for a beautiful lecture tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.